a 20-year-old king stands on the shores of Asia Minor, staring across the waters that separate Europe from Asia. Behind him, 35,000 soldiers wait for his command. Ahead lies the most powerful empire the world has ever known, the Persian Empire of Darius III, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, treasuries that could fund wars for decades, and a military machine that has dominated the known world for over 2 centuries. Any rational person would call this suicide, but in 11 years, this young man will control an empire stretching from Greece to India, covering more territory than any conqueror before or since. He will never lose a single battle. He will be called a god by those he conquers and a genius by history itself. His name will echo through the ages as the greatest military commander who ever lived. Or will it? Because here's the thing about Alexander the Great that most people don't realize. There's a fierce debate among historians about whether his unprecedented success was the result of brilliant strategic genius or simply the most incredible streak of luck in military history. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into history's most controversial questions. I'm your host, and I'm about to take you on a journey through one of the most spectacular military careers ever recorded to answer a question that has puzzled scholars for over 2,000 years. Was Alexander of Macedon a strategic mastermind whose innovations revolutionized warfare? Or was he just an ambitious young man who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right army? The answer might surprise you because the more we examine the evidence, the more complex this question becomes. Let's start with what everyone agrees on. Alexander's record is undeniably impressive. In 13 years of active campaigning, he conquered more territory than Rome would control at its peak. He defeated armies that vastly outnumbered his own. He founded over 20 cities, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and created an empire that, while short-lived, fundamentally changed the course of world history. But here's where it gets interesting. Almost everything about Alexander's success can be interpreted in 2 completely different ways, depending on whether you believe in genius or luck. Take his birth, for instance. Alexander was born in 356 BCE as the son of Philip II of Macedon, and this is where our first major piece of evidence for the luck theory emerges. Philip II wasn't just any king. He was arguably one of the greatest military innovators in ancient history, a man who had already conquered most of Greece and was planning to invade Persia when he was assassinated. Alexander inherited not just a throne, but a military machine that was already the most advanced in the world. Philip had revolutionized warfare with the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers carrying 18-foot spears called sarissas that could devastate traditional armies. He had created the companion cavalry, an elite heavy cavalry unit that would become Alexander's most important tactical weapon. He had built a professional army with advanced siege equipment, standardized training, and logistical capabilities that no other force could match. So when 20-year-old Alexander took the throne, he didn't inherit a struggling kingdom. He inherited a military superpower that was already primed for conquest. The luck theorists argue that any competent commander could have achieved great things with Philip's army and Philip's plans. But here's where the genius side presents their first counter-argument. Inheriting a great army is one thing, but knowing how to use it is something entirely different. History is littered with examples of great military powers that collapsed under weak leadership. Alexander not only maintained his father's innovations, but improved upon them in ways that demonstrated tactical brilliance. Consider Alexander's first major test, the revolt of Thebes in 335 BCE. When Alexander marched north to deal with barbarian threats, the Greek city-states assumed the young king would be too distracted to maintain control over his southern territories. Thebes declared independence and called for other cities to join them in throwing off Macedonian rule. Alexander's response reveals either calculated genius or reckless luck, depending on your perspective. Instead of slowly consolidating his position or negotiating, Alexander force-marched his army 240 miles in just 13 days, appearing before the walls of Thebes before the Thebans even knew he was coming. The speed of his response was so shocking that most of the other Greek cities immediately abandoned any thoughts of rebellion. But Alexander didn't just show up. he demonstrated a psychological understanding of warfare that would characterize his entire career. Rather than simply defeating Thebes, he utterly destroyed the city, selling its population into slavery and razing its buildings to the ground. The message was clear. Rebellion against Alexander wouldn't just be defeated, it would be obliterated. Was this the calculated decision of a strategic genius who understood that shocking brutality against one city would prevent years of future rebellions? Or was it the lucky result of a young man's temper tantrum that happened to have the right psychological effect? The debate continues when we examine Alexander's decision to invade Asia. His father Philip had been planning this invasion for years, but Philip's plan was relatively modest. Cross the Hellespont, liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule, perhaps gain some territory and tribute, and return home as a hero. Alexander took this plan and expanded it beyond anything Philip had ever imagined. Instead of a limited campaign, Alexander envisioned the complete conquest of the Persian Empire. Instead of a quick raid, he planned a campaign that would take him to the ends of the known world. Again, we can interpret this in two ways. The genius theory suggests that Alexander understood something his father hadn't, that the Persian Empire, despite its vast size and apparent power, was actually vulnerable to the kind of rapid, decisive warfare that the Macedonian army specialized in. Alexander supposedly recognized that Persia's strength was also its weakness. The empire was so large that it couldn't respond quickly to threats, and its diverse population had little loyalty to the Persian crown. The luck theory counters that Alexander was simply an ambitious young man who got in over his head, but happened to encounter an empire that was already in decline. The Persian Empire in 334 BCE was indeed facing internal problems. Rebellions in Egypt, unrest among the satraps, provincial governors, and a military that had grown soft from decades of peace. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE with his army of 35,000 men, he was potentially walking into a trap that could have ended his career before it really began. The Persian satrap Arsaces had assembled a force of about 40,000 men, including 20,000 Greek mercenaries, to meet the Macedonian invasion. The resulting Battle of the Granicus River provides our first real test case for the genius versus luck debate, and the details are absolutely fascinating. Alexander's army approached the Granicus River to find the Persian force arrayed on the opposite bank, in a strong defensive position. The Persians had placed their cavalry in front, with the Greek mercenaries held in reserve behind them. The riverbank was steep and muddy, making a frontal assault extremely dangerous. Alexander's generals, including the experienced Parmenion, advised waiting until the next day to find a better crossing point, or to maneuver the Persians out of their strong position. This was sound military advice from seasoned commanders who understood the risks of attacking across a river against a prepared enemy. Alexander ignored their advice completely. He ordered an immediate frontal assault across the river, personally leading the charge with his companion cavalry. To his officers, this must have seemed like suicide. A young, inexperienced king throwing away his army and his life in a reckless attack. But here's what happened next, and it's one of the most debated moments in military history. The Persian cavalry, instead of maintaining their disciplined formation and cutting down the Macedonians as they struggled across the muddy river, broke ranks and charged forward to engage in individual combat. This played directly into Alexander's hands because the Macedonian cavalry were better trained for close combat, and the broken Persian formation allowed Alexander's infantry to cross the river safely and deploy on the far bank. Was this the result of Alexander's psychological insight into Persian military culture? Understanding that their noble cavalry couldn't resist the chance for individual glory, and would abandon their tactical advantage for personal combat? Or was Alexander just incredibly lucky that the Persians made such a fundamental tactical error? The battle's climax adds another layer to the mystery. Alexander, fighting in the front ranks as he always did, found himself surrounded by Persian nobles who had specifically targeted him for death. At one point, a Persian commander named Spithridates raised his sword to strike down the Macedonian king. Alexander would have died right there, ending his career after a single battle, except that his friend Clitus the Black split Spithridates' skull with a perfectly timed blow. So was Alexander's survival the result of his tactical genius in positioning himself where he could inspire his troops while still having protection from his companions? Or was it pure luck that his friend happened to be in the right place at the right time to save his life? The Battle of the Granicus established a pattern that would define Alexander's entire career. Seemingly reckless tactics that somehow resulted in brilliant victories. And this pattern continued as Alexander moved deeper into Asia. After Granicus, Alexander spent a year consolidating his control over Asia Minor. But he did it in a way that revealed either strategic genius or incredible good fortune. Instead of simply occupying territory, Alexander made a series of decisions that would prove crucial to his long-term success. First, he proclaimed himself the liberator of the Greek cities, freeing them from Persian rule and restoring their traditional governments. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a sophisticated political strategy that turned potential enemies into allies and denied the Persians local support. Second, Alexander made a pilgrimage to Troy, where he honored the hero Achilles and proclaimed himself the heir to the Greek heroes who had fought in the Trojan War. This might seem like a publicity stunt, but it served multiple purposes. It linked Alexander's invasion to one of the most beloved stories in Greek culture. It inspired his troops by connecting them to legendary heroes, and it sent a message to both Greeks and Persians that this was not just a military campaign, but a continuation of the eternal struggle between East and West. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Alexander began incorporating Persian customs and personnel into his administration. Rather than ruling as a foreign conqueror, he started presenting himself as a legitimate successor to Persian authority. This was either a stroke of political genius that would allow him to rule a diverse empire, or a lucky accident that happened to work out well. But Alexander's most crucial test was yet to come, because Darius III, the Persian king of kings, was assembling the largest army in ancient history to crush this upstart Macedonian once and for all. The two armies met at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, and this engagement provides perhaps the strongest evidence for Alexander's genius, or the strongest evidence for his incredible luck, depending on how you interpret the events. Darius had assembled an army that ancient sources claim numbered anywhere from 300,000 to 600,000 men, though modern historians suggest the real number was probably around 100,000, still nearly 3 times the size of Alexander's force. The Persian army included elite units from across the empire, the famous immortals, Greek mercenaries, cavalry from Media and Bactria, and archers from throughout the Persian territories. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Darius made a decision that would baffle military historians for centuries. Instead of using his numerical advantage in the open plains where his cavalry and archers could maneuver freely, he chose to fight in the narrow coastal plain near Issus, where his superior numbers would be largely neutralized. Why would an experienced king make such an obviously poor tactical decision? The luck theorists argue that Darius simply made a mistake, and Alexander was fortunate that his enemy chose the worst possible battlefield. The genius theorists, however, suggest that Alexander had maneuvered Darius into this position through a series of calculated moves designed to force the Persian king into a tactical error. The battle itself seemed to confirm Darius's mistake. Despite having a much larger army, the Persians couldn't deploy their full strength in the narrow battlefield. Alexander's tactical innovations, particularly his use of the companion cavalry in an oblique attack, broke through the Persian lines and headed straight for Darius himself. And here's where one of the most controversial moments in ancient history occurred. When Alexander and his cavalry broke through the Persian center and approached Darius's position, the Persian king fled the battlefield, abandoning his army and his family to escape capture. This moment raises fundamental questions about the nature of Alexander's success. Did Alexander's tactical genius create a situation where Darius had no choice but to flee? Or did the Persian king simply panic at a crucial moment, handing Alexander a victory that could have gone either way? The consequences of Issus were enormous. Alexander captured Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and daughters. He gained access to the Persian royal treasury, providing him with the wealth needed to fund his continued campaigns. Most importantly, he demonstrated to the entire known world that the supposedly invincible Persian Empire could be defeated. But Alexander's treatment of the captured Persian royal family provides another clue to understanding his character. Instead of treating them as prisoners or bargaining chips, Alexander showed them extraordinary honor and respect. He ensured that Darius's family was treated according to their royal status, and he refused to use them as leverage in negotiations with the Persian king. Was this another example of Alexander's political genius? Understanding that showing mercy and respect would encourage other Persian nobles to accept his rule? Or was it simply the natural generosity of a young man who hadn't yet been corrupted by power? After Issus, Alexander made another decision that reveals either strategic brilliance or reckless overconfidence. Instead of pursuing Darius immediately and potentially ending the war with a single decisive campaign, Alexander turned south toward Egypt and the wealthy Phoenician cities of the eastern Mediterranean. This decision has puzzled historians for centuries. Alexander had just defeated the main Persian army and captured the royal family. Darius was in retreat and probably couldn't assemble another major force for months. The logical military move would have been to press his advantage and finish the war quickly. Instead, Alexander spent over a year conquering Egypt and the Phoenician coast, giving Darius time to rebuild his forces and prepare for another confrontation. The luck theorists point to this as evidence that Alexander was too inexperienced to understand basic strategic principles. The genius theorists argue that Alexander understood something more subtle, that controlling the eastern Mediterranean was essential for maintaining his supply lines and preventing the Persian navy from cutting off his retreat. The siege of Tyre, which took Alexander 7 months to complete, illustrates the complexity of this debate. Tyre was built on an island half a mile from the coast, making it virtually impregnable to ancient siege techniques. Most commanders would have simply bypassed such a strong position, accepting that some cities couldn't be taken. Alexander's solution was to build a causeway from the mainland to the island, essentially creating a land bridge that would allow his siege engines to reach the city walls. This was an engineering project of staggering ambition that required moving millions of tons of earth and stone while under constant attack from the Tyrian navy. The project seemed doomed to failure multiple times. The Tyrians destroyed Alexander's causeway with fire ships. They sent divers to sabotage the construction. They sortied with their navy to attack the workers. Any rational commander might have given up and moved on to easier targets. But Alexander persisted, and after 7 months, Tyre fell. The conquest of this supposedly impregnable city sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, and demonstrated that Alexander's army could overcome any obstacle. Was the siege of Tyre the product of Alexander's engineering genius and unwavering determination? Or was it the stubborn refusal of a young man to accept defeat, which happened to work out through sheer persistence and the superior resources of his army? While Alexander was besieging Tyre, Darius sent him a letter offering to make peace. The Persian king proposed to give Alexander all the territory west of the Euphrates River, pay an enormous ransom for his family, and seal the agreement with a marriage alliance between Alexander and one of his daughters. This was an incredibly generous offer that would have given Alexander control over a vast territory and enormous wealth. His general Parmenion supposedly said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept this offer." Alexander's reply has become one of the most famous quotes in military history. "If I were Parmenion, I would accept it too." Was this the response of a strategic genius who understood that accepting Darius's offer would leave the Persian Empire intact and capable of future revenge? Or was it the arrogance of a young conqueror who was drunk on his own success and couldn't see the risks he was taking? Alexander's decision to reject Darius's peace offer set up the final confrontation between the two empires, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. This engagement would provide the definitive test of whether Alexander was a genius or simply lucky. Darius had learned from his previous defeats. This time, he chose the battlefield carefully, selecting a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela, where his superior numbers and cavalry could be used to maximum effect. He had the battlefield specially prepared, leveling the ground to give his scythe chariots the best possible conditions for their charge. The Persian army that faced Alexander at Gaugamela was possibly the largest ever assembled in ancient times. Darius had called upon every corner of his empire: elephants from India, scythed chariots from the steppes, cavalry from Bactria and Sogdiana, infantry from every Persian province. Ancient sources suggest the Persian army numbered over 1 million men, though modern estimates place it at around 250,000, still more than 5 times larger than Alexander's force. Alexander's army, by contrast, numbered only about 47,000 men. He was outnumbered, fighting on ground of his enemy's choosing, facing weapons and tactics he had never encountered before. By any rational calculation, he should have been annihilated. The night before the battle, Alexander's officers were nervous about the overwhelming odds they faced. But Alexander himself seemed remarkably calm, sleeping so soundly that his officers had to wake him on the morning of the battle. When asked how he could sleep so peacefully before such a crucial engagement, Alexander supposedly replied that he had already won the battle by forcing Darius to face him in open combat. Was this confidence the result of Alexander's strategic insight into the weaknesses of the Persian army? Or was it the naive fearlessness of youth combined with incredible luck? The Battle of Gaugamela began with Darius's attempt to use his numerical superiority to outflank Alexander's army. The Persians extended their line far beyond Alexander's flanks, threatening to surround the smaller Macedonian force. Most commanders facing such odds would have tried to refuse their flanks or form a defensive square. Alexander did something completely different. Instead of trying to match the Persian extension, he began moving his entire army diagonally to the right, effectively refusing to fight on Darius's terms. This move forced the Persian line to shift and stretch as they tried to maintain contact with the Macedonians. As the Persian line stretched and thinned, gaps began to appear in their formation. Alexander, commanding from his usual position at the head of the companion cavalry, spotted these gaps and launched a devastating charge directly at Darius's position in the center of the Persian line. But here's where the battle takes another controversial turn. Just as at Issus, when Alexander's cavalry broke through to threaten Darius personally, the Persian king fled the battlefield. For the second time, the supposedly great king of kings abandoned his army to save his own life. The Persian army, seeing their king in flight, collapsed into rout. What should have been Alexander's most difficult battle became another complete victory for the Macedonians. This raises the same questions we encountered at Issus, but with even higher stakes. Did Alexander's tactical genius create conditions that made Darius's flight inevitable? Or did the Persian king's personal cowardice hand Alexander another victory that he might not have deserved? The aftermath of Gaugamela seemed to settle the question of Alexander's abilities. With the Persian field army destroyed and Darius in flight, the great cities of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, opened their gates to Alexander without resistance. The conqueror found himself master of treasuries containing wealth beyond imagination, and ruler of the richest empire in the world. But just when it seemed that Alexander had proven his genius beyond doubt, his behavior took a turn that has puzzled historians ever since. Instead of consolidating his conquests and establishing a stable government, Alexander made a series of decisions that seemed to undermine everything he had accomplished. First, Alexander began adopting Persian customs and requiring his Macedonian officers to perform proskinesis, the Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king. To Greeks and Macedonians, this was tantamount to worshiping Alexander as a god, and it caused tremendous resentment among his own officers. Second, Alexander began recruiting Persian soldiers into his army and placing Persian nobles in positions of authority. While this might seem like sensible policy for ruling a diverse empire, it created the impression among his Macedonian veterans that their king was abandoning his own people in favor of former enemies. Third, Alexander decided to continue his conquest beyond Persia, launching campaigns into Central Asia and eventually India that would take him far from the Mediterranean world and into regions that most Greeks didn't even know existed. Were these the decisions of a political genius who understood that ruling a multicultural empire required adopting multicultural practices? Or were they the mistakes of a young conqueror who had been corrupted by power and lost touch with the realities of leadership? The question becomes even more complex when we examine Alexander's campaigns in Central Asia. The fighting in Bactria and Sogdiana was some of the most difficult of his entire career. Instead of facing conventional armies in pitched battles, Alexander found himself engaged in guerrilla warfare against local tribes who knew the terrain and could strike without warning. For 3 years, Alexander's army struggled to pacify regions that seemed to offer little strategic value. His soldiers began to grumble about fighting in distant lands for obscure purposes. The easy victories of the Persian campaigns were replaced by grinding warfare against enemies who refused to fight conventional battles. During this period, Alexander made some of his most controversial decisions. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, in what was clearly a political alliance designed to win local support. He executed Philotas, one of his most trusted generals, for allegedly plotting against him. Most shocking of all, he killed Clitus the Black, the same man who had saved his life at the Granicus River, in a drunken rage during a banquet. These incidents have been cited as evidence that Alexander was losing his grip on reality, becoming increasingly paranoid and violent as the pressures of command wore him down. The luck theorists argue that this period reveals Alexander's true character. An ambitious but ultimately flawed young man who succeeded only as long as circumstances favored him. But the genius theorists point out that despite these problems, Alexander continued to achieve his military objectives. He pacified Central Asia, secured his lines of communication, and created a stable base for his next phase of conquest. His marriage to Roxana, while controversial, did help win over local populations and reduce resistance to Macedonian rule. The ultimate test of Alexander's abilities came with his invasion of India in 326 BCE. This campaign would push both Alexander and his army to their absolute limits and provide the final evidence for judging whether his success was based on genius or luck. The Indian campaign began promisingly enough. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains and entered the Indus River Valley, where he was welcomed by King Taxios, who saw an alliance with the Macedonians as a way to defeat his local enemies. But when Alexander reached the Hydaspes River, he encountered King Porus, who commanded an army unlike anything the Macedonians had ever faced. Porus had not only cavalry and infantry, but also war elephants, enormous beasts that could trample soldiers and terrify horses. The Battle of the Hydaspes would be Alexander's most tactically complex victory, requiring him to overcome not just numerical disadvantage, but also completely unfamiliar military technology. Alexander's solution was a masterpiece of deception and tactical innovation. Instead of attacking Porus directly, Alexander spent weeks moving his army up and down the riverbank, creating the impression that he was looking for a crossing point. This constant activity exhausted the Indian army, which had to respond to every movement while remaining ready for battle. Finally, Alexander secretly moved a portion of his army 18 miles upstream during a thunderstorm, crossing the swollen river under cover of darkness and rain. When Porus discovered this flanking force, he had to choose between dividing his army or allowing Alexander to attack his rear. The battle that followed demonstrated Alexander's ability to adapt his tactics to completely new circumstances. He used his cavalry to neutralize the war elephants, turning these fearsome weapons against the Indian infantry. His phalanx, modified to deal with elephant attacks, managed to maintain formation despite facing completely unfamiliar threats. Alexander's victory at the Hydaspes was arguably his greatest tactical achievement, but it came at an enormous cost. His army had been fighting for 11 years without a break. They were thousands of miles from home, in a land they didn't understand, facing enemies who used tactics they had never encountered. When Alexander announced his intention to continue eastward toward the Ganges River and the vast armies that supposedly awaited there, his army finally rebelled. For the first time in his career, Alexander's soldiers refused to follow him further. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River marks the end of Alexander's conquests and the beginning of the end of his career. Some historians see this as the moment when Alexander's limitations finally caught up with him, when his ambition exceeded his ability to inspire loyalty, and his strategic vision outpaced his tactical resources. Others argue that the mutiny actually proves Alexander's genius. By pushing his army to their absolute limits, he had discovered exactly how much human beings could endure. His willingness to accept his soldiers' decision and turn back showed political wisdom and an understanding of leadership that his earlier career had perhaps lacked. But Alexander's response to the end of his conquest raises new questions about his character and abilities. Instead of accepting the mutiny as a natural end to his campaigns, Alexander seemed to fall into a depression that affected his judgment and leadership for the rest of his life. The return journey from India was marked by unnecessary hardships and poor decisions. Alexander's march through the Gedrosian desert cost thousands of lives and served no apparent strategic purpose. His increasingly erratic behavior, including his demand that Greek cities worship him as a god, alienated many of his supporters. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, his empire immediately began to fragment. His generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, fought a series of wars that lasted for decades and ultimately divided Alexander's conquests into separate kingdoms. The rapid collapse of Alexander's empire after his death is often cited as evidence that his success was more dependent on his personal leadership than on sustainable institutions or policies. The luck theorists argue that this proves Alexander was more of a talented individual than a true strategic genius. His conquests couldn't survive his death because they were based on his personal charisma rather than systematic planning. The genius theorists countered that the empire's fragmentation was inevitable given its size and diversity, and that Alexander's real achievement was not in creating a lasting political structure but in fundamentally changing the nature of the ancient world. The spread of Greek culture throughout Asia, the founding of cities that would become major centers of learning and trade, and the integration of Eastern and Western traditions would have lasting effects that far outlived any political empire. So what's the verdict? After examining all the evidence, was Alexander the Great a military genius or just a lucky conqueror? The truth, as often happens in history, is probably somewhere in between. Alexander was undoubtedly gifted with exceptional personal courage, charisma, and tactical instincts. His ability to inspire loyalty in his troops, adapt to new situations, and see opportunities that others miss suggests genuine leadership abilities that go beyond mere luck. But Alexander also benefited enormously from circumstances beyond his control. He inherited Philip's revolutionary army and strategic plans. He faced a Persian Empire that was already weakening from internal problems. He encountered several enemy commanders who made crucial mistakes at decisive moments. Perhaps most importantly, Alexander's success was built on the work of thousands of other people. His generals who executed his plans, his engineers who built his siege equipment, his logisticians who kept his army supplied, and his diplomats who negotiated with local populations. Military genius, if it exists at all, is always a collaborative effort. What we can say definitively is that Alexander's impact on history was enormous and lasting. Whether through genius or luck or some combination of both, he created an empire that spread Greek culture across the known world, established cities that would flourish for centuries, and set precedents for leadership and conquest that would influence military thinking for thousands of years. The Romans studied Alexander's campaigns and tried to emulate his methods. Medieval commanders read accounts of his battles and attempted to copy his tactics. Modern military academies still teach Alexander's strategies as examples of tactical excellence. But perhaps Alexander's greatest achievement was not in conquering territory, but in expanding human understanding of what was possible. Before Alexander, no one imagined that a single individual could unite Europe, Africa, and Asia under one rule. No one believed that Greek culture could take root in India, or that Persian traditions could be blended with Macedonian practices. Alexander proved that the boundaries between civilizations were not as fixed as people believed, that cultural exchange could enrich rather than weaken societies, and that human ambition could achieve things that seemed impossible. Whether that achievement was the result of genius or luck may be less important than the fact that it happened at all. In the end, the debate over Alexander's abilities tells us as much about our own time as it does about ancient Macedonia. We want to believe in individual genius because it gives us hope that exceptional individuals can change the world. But we also recognize the role of luck and circumstance because it helps us understand that success is rarely the result of individual effort alone. Alexander the Great was probably both a tactical genius and an extraordinarily lucky individual. He possessed genuine abilities that allowed him to take advantage of favorable circumstances, but those circumstances were themselves crucial to his success. Remove either element, the talent or the luck, and Alexander's story might have been very different. What cannot be debated is that Alexander's life was one of the most remarkable in all of human history. In just 32 years, he went from being the king of a small Balkan kingdom to the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. He crossed continents, defeated armies, founded cities, and left a legacy that would influence civilization for millennia. Whether he achieved all this through genius or luck may be the wrong question. Perhaps the real question is whether there's any meaningful difference between the two when the results are so extraordinary. And that brings us to the end of our examination of one of history's most fascinating figures here at Professor Archive. Whether you believe Alexander was a brilliant strategist or just incredibly fortunate, there's no denying that his story continues to captivate us more than 2,000 years after his death. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient military history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got plenty more controversial historical debates to explore together. What do you think? Was Alexander a genius or just lucky? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, the best historical questions are often the ones without easy answers. Until next time, this is Professor Archive reminding you that sometimes the most important thing about a historical figure isn't what they achieved, but why we're still arguing about them thousands of years later.